November 1747, the British fleet comes into Boston Harbor. The British and French empires are at war, and Massachusetts troops have just taken the fortress of Louisburg and Cape Breton, the Gibraltar of the North Atlantic. Now, Commodore Charles Knowles, commander of the British fleet, realizes that he's probably had 40 to 50 men who have absconded. That is, they've come into a port, there are merchant ships around, they've gone off the naval vessels, gotten onto the merchant ships where they blend in, they speak the same language, they're sailors, and now they're getting paid. When they're in the British Navy, paid poorly, flogged often, terrible food. So when sailors have a clear opportunity, they might desert, which of course is punishable by death hanging from the yardarm, but worth it, I suppose, if you're in the British Navy with no real prospect of getting out. Now, Knowles understands that he needs to get about 50 more men so that he can get his fleet across the Atlantic or onto its next port. So he orders that about 50 sailors be rounded up in the streets of Boston to replace those who have absconded. And under British law, this is perfectly within his right to have press gangs go and round up sailors, able-bodied men who owe their service to their king. Now, what happens next is really quite phenomenal. Knowles does order press gangs to round up 50 men, and on the morning of November 17th, 1747, Governor William Shirley is woken at the Province House, his official residence on Washington Street, by an angry mob. Several hundred people, women, men, who have come to protest the enslavement, they say, of their brothers, their husbands, their co-workers, who have been snatched off the streets of Boston and dragooned into His Majesty's service. Now, with the mob are half a dozen or so British naval officers. Now, the officers don't spend their time on the fleet when it's in port. They've been renting rooms. They've been staying with friends. They haven't been living out on the ships. And people in Boston know where these guys are. So they had kidnapped them, and now they bring them as hostages to Governor Shirley, and they say, release the 50 men who have been taken on the British fleet, and we'll release these officers. This is quite a dilemma for Governor Shirley. Well, Shirley is a general. He is the supreme military commander of British forces in North America, and he's not someone to be bullied by a mob, and Shirley and his son stride up to this mob who were showing him these officers, and they snatched them. They snatched these officers, saying, what are you doing getting taken by the mob? Bring them onto this side of the fence. So now Shirley and the officers are on one side and several hundred angry people on the other. And Shirley persuades the crowd that he needs to consider what to do next with the governor's council. He can't simply order the fleet to release the sailors. This is a bigger problem than that. He empathizes, but he quite clearly understands the law. So Shirley will convene the governor's council. This is the advisory body appointed by the assembly that advises the governor. Now, the governor is appointed by the British Crown. He's not from around here. The council represents the towns of Massachusetts. The governor represents the Crown. The council is an intermediary. So Shirley convenes the governor's council, this time at the townhouse, the official meeting place for the provincial government, now known as the Old State House in downtown Boston. Council meets on the second floor, and Shirley had taken the precaution of posting some militia troops on the steps leading to the second floor. And as the council is meeting, they hear the crowd coming into the first floor, breaking the windows, because the crowd wants to be heard in the governor's council. Fortunately, the troops are able to keep the crowd downstairs. The governor's council considers this whole problem. Well, Commodore Knowles has a solution to the problem. His fleet will start shelling the town. They can burn it down, and that will teach these people a lesson for protesting British law. Shirley realizes that's not going to be a long-term solution to this problem. And so over the next week or two, you have this recurring rioting, demonstrations. At one point, the crowd gets a boat that they think is a longboat from one of the British ships, and they haul it up to the Province House and try to set it on fire in front of Shirley's residence. Unfortunately for them, it doesn't burn. It's a boat that's been sitting in the water, and also it's not actually one of the Royal Naval vessels. It comes from a merchant ship in Boston Harbor, and ultimately they take it up to Boston Common and burn it. So you have a standoff. Knowles won't release the men. The crowd won't stop demanding that they do so. Knowles wants to shell the town. Ultimately, Shirley does persuade Knowles he has to release these men. He cannot impress Bostonians into the British Navy. It's more trouble than it's worth. And Knowles sails away sadly, goes to New York, where he has no trouble at all rounding up able-bodied sailors. And Shirley now is faced with a dilemma. When word gets back to London that he has essentially caved into a mob, what will happen? Shirley recognizes, though, that his options are limited. Knowles could have shelled the town, and then Knowles would have sailed away, and Shirley would have been left with a few thousand furious Bostonians. These people are still going to be here. On the other hand, British law does permit the impressment of sailors in Boston, but Shirley wisely decided that British law was less important than the immediate here and now. He's also wary that what will happen when the British government hears about this will surely be the one punished. That is, he would not let Knowles round up able-bodied sailors. So Shirley writes a very careful letter to the Lords of Trade in London. This is the body that oversees the colonies. And he explains what he had done, the political reasons for it, but also advises that something needs to be done to change the democratical nature of the American Constitution, or the way government is constructed in Boston. As I said, the Assembly is elected by the towns. Each town in Massachusetts sends delegates to the Assembly. And the town meeting, which chooses these delegates, is the governing body of each town. It is the most democratic government in any British territory, and probably in any place in the world. The people in the towns of Massachusetts have more power over their own affairs than anyone else. And Shirley sees this as a problem. Because in Boston, any 10 men can sign a writ that they want a town meeting. Even 10 of the meanest sort, that is the poorest people, can say, we want a town meeting. And whoever goes to that meeting then is the official voice of the town. Those 10 guys can call a meeting, and if no one else shows up, well, it's an official town meeting. They've called it, and they can decide what town policy is. Shirley sees this democratical nature as a dangerous thing. In the long term, it's going to lead to trouble. Right now you have this flare-up over impressment of sailors. Well, what happens if there are other British policies that are interfering with what these folks preconceive to be their rights or their obligations to their community? What will happen then? So something, Shirley says, needs to be done to correct the democratical nature of these constitutions. Now, Boston is known to be kind of a contentious place. These mobs seem to turn out with very little provocation. One very colorful demonstration of this is every year on the 5th of November. Now, back in 1604, a group of Catholics led by Guy Fawkes had tried to blow up the British Houses of Parliament, which were, of course, led by Protestants. And they were stopped, they were prevented, and then these culprits were executed, drawn, and quartered. And ever after in England, the 5th of November is observed as Guy Fawkes Day. Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. And here in Boston, beginning really in the late 17th century, that is in the late 1600s, some Bostonians observed Pope's Day. In the South End, longshoremen, dock workers, shipbuilders, rope makers, these guys from the maritime trades would get together and they would construct, well, we would call it a float, a parade float. On a wagon, they would build an effigy of the Pope. And then they would start parading through the streets at sunset on November 5th, carrying torches and stopping in every tavern demanding to be served. And they really liked it if homeowners would illuminate their windows, putting up decorations saying, "We hate the Pope," or maybe an image of the Pope and the devil to show their solidarity with this anti-Pope feeling, anti-church and anti-Catholicism feeling. They wind their way through the streets of the South End, getting progressively drunker, singing songs, chanting. They also like it if people do not illuminate your windows, if somehow someone is not on the same, not have the same anti-Pope sentiment, because then these guys can smash the windows. If a tavern owner is too slow in serving them, they will serve themselves. So progressively drunker, this parade is making its way through the south end of Boston, the area that is now Boston's financial district. Meanwhile, in the north end, another group, longshoremen, dock workers, rope makers, has made their float with an effigy of the Pope, and they're wending their way through the taverns and narrow streets of the north end. Two groups protesting the power of the Pope, who has absolutely no power in Boston, and chanting, showing their disapproval and their solidarity with Protestants everywhere. And ultimately, the two groups will meet at Dock Square near Faneuil Hall. And when they do meet, they will have a terrific brawl where they will pummel each other. And the South End group tries to capture the North End Pope. The North End group is trying to capture the South End Pope. If the South Enders win, they drag both popes to Boston Common and have a great bonfire. If the North Enders win, they have the bonfire right in front of Faneuil Hall. So you have destruction of property, you have fire, you have drunkenness, things that appeal to a certain segment of the population. Now, some folks in Boston, the property owners, the more well-established folks, say maybe we should do something to tamp down these demonstrations, because this could cause significant damage. And what does it mean on November 5th? You have these mobs roaming the streets, getting drunk, with bonfires and fights and so on. And others say, well, these guys work hard 364 days a year. Let them on November 5th turn out and have a little fun. Actually, in the late 1750s, the cart from the South End runs over a 12-year-old boy and it crushes his skull, kills him. At this point, some of the authorities think maybe it's time to bring some order here. So the leader of the South End mob, a shoemaker named Ebenezer McIntosh, is charged with manslaughter. That is, he's responsible for this mayhem, which has caused the death of a 12-year-old boy. And Mr. McIntosh is charged with manslaughter and is put on trial. So you have in the court in Boston, Mr. McIntosh charged with manslaughter, and you have the jury of 12 Bostonians, and in the courtroom you have several hundred of Mr. McIntosh's friends from the South End. You just sit there looking at the jurors. Boston is a small town. They know where the jurors live. All they need to do is sit there and look at the jurors, and the jurors don't even have to leave the box to find Mr. McIntosh not guilty. No one can convict Mr. McIntosh of anything, which is going to give Mr. McIntosh a great deal more sway. Someone said that McIntosh could be leading 200 seemingly intoxicated men through the streets of Boston. If he raised his hand, they would all be quiet. He had some significant ability to persuade them and keep them on his side, which is going to give McIntosh a good deal of power. So this is the state of things in Boston in the 1760s, and at the time of the Stamp Act, it's McIntosh's folks who turn out to tear down Andrew Oliver's warehouse and then hang Oliver in effigy. And it's the South End mob or the North End mob that are turning out to give real power to the warnings of Samuel Adams or James Otis. Really a fearsome thing. And when in the debates over the Stamp Act, one member of Parliament talks about the mobs, are we going to give in to mobs? Another member of Parliament, Isaac Barry, says they're not mobs. They are the free-born sons of liberty seeking to protect their God-given rights as Englishmen. Well, Ebenezer McIntosh knows a good title when he hears one. For years he's just been this troublesome shoemaker, leader of the South End mob. Now he becomes the Captain General of the Sons of Liberty, and the big tree with which the South End mob uses to decorate with effigies of the Pope and later effigies of Lord Bute or other British officials becomes the Liberty Tree. So Boston still is a contentious place with this threat of violence from the lower orders, and this is one of the real stories here from the 1740s when a mob turns out to protest impressment, through the 1760s when a mob will turn out to protest the Stamp Act. This is what convinces Governor Bernard in the late 1760s, when Parliament passes the Townshend duties, that if we are going to protect the customs commissioners and actually collect these taxes, we will need military force in a lawless place like Boston.